Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Payne Fund, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I am Merle Johnson, a member of the State Board of Education and a proud City Club member. It is my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, the President and CEO for the Education Trust and the 10th United States Secretary of Education, Dr. John B. King, Jr. There is arguably no more significant topic in education than the role of educational inequality, defined as the unequal or an inequitable distribution of academic resources, including school funding, access to books and technology, and qualified and experienced teachers to communities that are historically disadvantaged in forecasting student success. As America moves to become a minority-majority nation, it is predicted that white students will shrink to represent less than 50% of public school students by 2025. Persistent gaps in educational experience and attainment for low-income and minority children result in limited economic opportunities for these students when they reach adulthood. Federal policies like No Child Left Behind and the Every Student Succeeds Act, commonly referred to as ESSA, attempt to correct this imbalance. But are they working? What else can be done at the federal, state, and local levels to equip minority students with the tools they need to succeed? It is within this context that our speaker joins us today. Earlier this year, Dr. King was named the President and CEO of the Education Trust, a national nonprofit organization that seeks to identify and close opportunity and achievement gaps from preschool through college. Prior to accepting this position, he served in President Barack Obama's administration as the United States Secretary of Education from 2016 to 2017. In tapping him to lead the United States Department of Education, President Obama called King, quote, an exceptionally talented educator, end quote, citing his commitment to, quote, preparing every child for success, end quote, and his lifelong dedication to education as a teacher, principal, and leader of schools and school districts. Before becoming Education Secretary and beginning in January 2015, Dr. King carried out the duties of the United States Deputy Secretary of Education, overseeing all policies and programs related to preschool to 12 education, English learners, special education, and innovation. Dr. King joined the department following his tenure as the first African-American Puerto Rican to serve as New York State Education Commissioner, a post he held from 2011 to 2015. Dr. King's career in education includes serving as a high school social studies teacher in Puerto Rico and Boston, Massachusetts, and as a middle school principal. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Government from Harvard University, a Juris Doctorate from Yale Law School, as well as a Master of Arts in the Teaching of Social Studies, and a Doctorate in Education from Teachers College at Columbia University. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Dr. John B. King, Jr.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. So what I'm going to try to do for the next 25 minutes or so is try to share some data about where we are on education equity. And part of the goal for me in this conversation is to set the table for our discussion about what we do to ensure equality of education in our country. And I want to first acknowledge that we have students in the room, which is fantastic. Can we have a round of applause for the students who are here with us? I'm going to be particularly interested in their perspective on this question of what we do to strengthen our education system. So a bit about the Education Trust, the organization with which I work. We've been around for about 25 years, focused on expanding opportunity for low-income students and students of color, both in P through 12 education and in higher education. Now, where I want to start today is with some good news. And those of you who watch cable news, you may be looking for some good news in your life. And that's where I want to begin. This first slide is fourth grade performance in math in the United States using the NAEP assessment, which is administered to a sample of students from every state. Part of what is encouraging here, if you look to the far left of the slide, you see performance in 1990. You look to the far right, performance in 2015. Part of what I want to underscore is that we have made progress as a country. One can get discouraged by the continuing achievement gaps that we face, but we have made progress as a country over the last few decades, and that progress applies to all racial groups. The challenge, though, as you can see, looking to the far right of the slide, is that despite the progress, the gaps remain. Significant gaps in achievement for African American students and Latino students. And this is fourth grade math. You see similar trends in fourth grade reading. And this is high school graduation. Another piece of good news. Last year we had the highest graduation rate from high school we've ever had as a country at 83%. Right? That's because of the hard work of students, parents, teachers, administrators, the superintendents who are in this room. Right? We've seen tremendous progress that should be celebrated. And let's be clear. High school graduation does not always mean, unfortunately, that students are ready for what's next. Indeed, too often, graduating from high school isn't equivalent to being ready for college and careers. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that those young people who leave high school without even a high school diploma have virtually no chance of finding meaningful employment in the 21st century economy. So this is real progress that we've made. But even as we celebrate that progress, let me be clear, there is much, much more work to do in order to ensure that educational opportunity is available to all students. Let's look closer at the NAEP assessment. This is the share of students by race performing at each of the three levels on the NAEP assessment. The top in green is the percentage of students who are scoring proficient or advanced, the top two categories. In yellow, the percentage of students who are performing at the basic level. And at the bottom, the percentage of students who are below basic. And what I want to point out about this slide as we look at the comparison between racial groups and performance in fourth grade math is the staggering difference in the percentage of African American students who are performing at the below basic level versus the percentage of white students who are performing at the below basic level. You think about the consequences that will have for students long term. Right? This isn't saying that they're just behind. This is the students who are dramatically behind. And so we worry as a country how we can plan for a good economic future, a good future for our democracy when we see these large achievement gaps. Even more worrying is this slide, which is fourth grade reading performance. Look at the percentage of African American and Latino students who are below basic in 4th grade reading. And those of you who teach know that this is particularly worrisome because from K through 3, you learn to read. But from 3rd grade on, you read to learn. Right? Your ability to succeed in science or social studies or even in math depends on your ability to read text and draw from that text important information and ideas. It is very worrisome for our future when you see that nearly half of African American and Latino students are below basic in reading in 4th grade. We also know that one of the reasons that students fall behind is because of what's called the school-to-prison pipeline. And this slide shows you suspension rates by race nationally. You'll notice that the suspension rate for African American students significantly higher than the suspension rate for white students. On the left, boys. On the right, girls. One observation I shared with folks this morning, we know this problem begins in pre-K. African American pre-K students are nearly 4 times as likely to be suspended from school as white students, 4-year-olds. We also know that sometimes people have this conversation and they think school-to-prison pipeline is just about boys and young men of color. But in fact, if you look at the right-hand side of this slide, what you see is that the suspension rate for African American girls compared to white girls is significantly higher. In fact, you can go to communities around the country and find communities where African American girls are 7, 8 times as likely to be suspended from school as white female students. Similar numbers for Latina students. Right, so this isn't just a boy problem. This is a problem for kids of color in our schools. And one has to ask, why is this? And what are the consequences of this for students' long-term future? What is the message that students take away when what they hear from school is, we don't want you here, beginning at 4? Now, this next slide is on advanced coursework. This is access to AP classes, advanced placement classes. Now we know advanced placement classes are a way that students can gain college credit in high school. We know that students who take AP classes are more likely to go on to college, and we know that students who take AP classes are often able to get into the more selective colleges, in part because of their participation in those AP classes. Now, what you see in this slide is a comparison between the demographics of the graduating class from high school, the demographics of the test takers, and the demographics of the students who are earning a 3 or better. If you look for African American students, you see that while African American students account for nearly 15% of a graduating class, they account for less than 5% of the students who are getting a 3 or better on AP exams. This is about access and support. Now, what you see for Latino students is the numbers are more promising. And that's because these numbers include AP Spanish. If you take out AP Spanish, the number of Latino students earning a 3 or better in AP classes goes down by about half. Right, so what this means is that the very thing we know will help students access more opportunity, we are making inequitably available. I shared with folks this morning that the Civil Rights Data Collection Survey tells us that African American, Latino, and low-income students are more likely to attend high schools where you cannot take chemistry or physics or algebra 2 or calculus. Right, if you can't take the very classes that would be a prerequisite for these AP classes, right, what opportunity do you have to do the kinds of advanced coursework that would ensure your success later? Now, we talked about the progress on high school graduation rates. But the problem is we still see this achievement gap for high school graduation. And this is the national data. You can see that the graduation rate from high school for Latino students is about 10 points lower, and for African American students about 13 points lower. And again, think about what your life chances are in the 21st century economy without even a high school diploma. I want to argue that part of what is at the heart of these achievement gaps is inequitable access to quality teaching. Right? 80 to 90% of what school districts spend is spent on people, right? Teachers and principals. Right? So the key to educational quality is the relationship between a teacher and his or her students and the work in which they are engaged. And yet we know that our students with the greatest needs often get access to the least well-prepared, least effective teachers. This slide shows the percentage of teachers who are teaching outside of their field. Now, having an undergraduate degree in the subject you are teaching does not ensure that you'll be a good teacher. Knowing the content doesn't ensure that you'll be a good teacher. But I would submit that not knowing the content significantly increases the likelihood that you will not be effective, right? So this is out-of-field teaching. You'll see that the national percentage is 16%, but then when you look to the right, you see that high-poverty students are significantly more likely, twice as likely, to have a teacher who is teaching out of field. And again, when you think about access to things like advanced math, advanced science, then think about the impact of having a teacher who actually doesn't know the content well, preparing you, greatly reducing your likelihood of success. Now, this is the percentage of teachers who are leaving their schools. And what you see here is that high poverty schools are losing many more of their teachers, much more teacher turnover. The consequence of that is that teachers in high need schools tend to have to be in their first, second, third year with much greater frequency than in schools serving more affluent students. We know that teachers earlier in their career, on average, are less effective than teachers who've had 5 or more years of teaching experience. We also know that that churn of adults has an impact on school culture, less likely to form those deep relationships that make a huge difference. We also know there are large gaps in resources. This is a slide on the disparities in school funding. Now we know, Ed Trust did a study on school spending across the country. One of the things that's striking is that we, by design, spend less on the students who need the most. By design. Right? Some of our international competitors take the opposite view and are confused that we have chosen to invest more in the students who bring the most advantages and less in the students who bring the least advantages. But we do. The difference on average between affluent districts and those serving low-income students, it's about $1,200 per student, and we know that that varies between states. I was state commissioner in New York. In New York, we had districts where 2 neighboring districts might have a difference in per pupil spending of $10,000 or more per student. Interestingly, we also found that the gap is actually larger based on race. That is, that districts that serve larger numbers of African American or Latino students are spending about $2,000 less on average than districts that serve fewer students of color. What about Ohio? Well, there's some good news. Ohio is about in the middle of the pack in 4th grade reading among states. But when you then look inside of those numbers, you see these same achievement gaps in Ohio. This is the percentage of students achieving proficiency in 4th grade reading. 43% for white students, 16% for black students, 23% for Latino students. And this is by income. Majority of higher income students are achieving proficiency, less than a quarter of low income students. 8th grade math. Ohio, again, about in the middle of the pack among states. But then you look at the gaps. 40% of white students proficient, just 11% of African American students, and 24% of Latino students. Similar gap by income. About half of upper income students proficient, less than a quarter of low-income students. What about high school graduation? Well, there again, you see very significant gaps between white students and African American students and Latino students and English learners and students with disabilities and low-income students. Right. Now, we also know that teacher diversity matters. We talked this morning about the research evidence that suggests that, for example, a Johns Hopkins study that showed that having just one African American teacher for an African American student made it more likely that they would graduate from high school and more likely that they would go on to college. We know that African American students are less likely to suspend students of color and more likely to refer students of color for gifted programs. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't have excellent teachers of every race and ethnicity. We do. But there is something powerful about having the experience of having a teacher or a principal over the course of one's educational experience that looks like you. There's also something powerful, as I argued this morning, for white students in seeing teachers of color and principals of color in leadership roles in their classrooms and schools. In Ohio, while 20% of the students are students of color, only 2% of teachers are Latino, only 5% are African American. So that means that here in Ohio, as in many states, there are students of color who will spend their entire educational career never having had an educator who looks like them. We also know here in Ohio, as in the country, students who are low income are more likely to have inexperienced teachers, out-of-field teachers, and ineffective teachers by a significant margin. And this matters. It matters in the short run because of your performance within any given grade, but it also matters over time because these effects are compounded. The research suggests that having 3 effective teachers in a row has a huge benefit for your long-term academic performance, and similarly, having 3 ineffective teachers in a row can be devastating for your ability to become proficient. Now think about those students who are below basic in reading or math. Now imagine them having a series of inexperienced out-of-field teachers over a 3-year period. What chance then would they have to meet higher standards? Now, one good thing is Ohio does have this history of a state funding formula that does direct more resources to high needs districts. The question becomes, is that margin enough to make up for the increased concentration of need? Now go back one. This slide is revenues per student by poverty. This is revenues per student by race. You can see that Ohio does have this tradition around funding equity that is better than some other states, but I would submit not necessarily enough to address the concentration of need that results from concentrating lowest income, highest need students in a subset of schools. Now, I want to talk briefly about the Every Student Succeeds Act. And that's the federal education law that has as its goal trying to tackle some of the inequity that we've just discussed. And as I talked about this morning, that law is a civil rights law. It is the contemporary reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, a civil rights law, signed by President Lyndon Johnson in the context of having signed the Voting Rights Act. Right? The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that is the context for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And when President Obama signed the law, he talked about that history. He talked about the law upholding, the new law upholding the values behind the original Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And he said, most importantly, with this bill, we reaffirm that fundamental American ideal that every child, regardless of race, income, background, the zip code where they live, deserves the chance to make out of their lives what they will. It's a civil rights law. It built, forgive the high school social studies teacher and me for a little bit of the historical context, but we begin with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which directed resources. The goal of the law was to direct resources to the highest needs schools. But the concern over time was that additional resources were not translating into closing of achievement gaps. So the passage of No Child Left Behind in 2002 was intended to focus the nation's attention on those achievement gaps and required for the first time that data would be disaggregated to show separately the performance of African American students, Latino students, English learners. We know that prior to No Child Left Behind, for example, in the Southwest, there were many communities where they only reported for school performance the performance of kids who spoke English at home and left English learners invisible for the purposes of school accountability. But it is true that over time, as many of those of us who are in education know, provisions of No Child Left Behind became unworkable. And so the Obama administration provided waivers from No Child Left Behind to allow states to take a different approach. And that culminated with passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act. Some of the most important elements of that law. Every Student Succeeds Act requires every state to commit to college and career-ready standards, requires every state to commit to standards that will ensure that high school graduates graduate ready for credit-bearing coursework in college. That is an important aspiration and one I know folks in Ohio are working on. ESSA also maintains the requirement for annual assessments in English and math, and then in science, in elementary, middle, and high school. And those assessment requirements are important because that is how we know whether or not we are making progress on closing these achievement gaps. And importantly, it requires transparency and public reporting about results. It's a long list of the kinds of things that are required, but it's worth noting that the law for the first time requires much more reporting on the performance of homeless students, requires much more attention to whether or not English learners are reaching proficiency in the English language. It requires, for the first time, transparent reporting around per pupil expenditures, that is, how much is being spent in districts and from what sources. It also includes accountability. And why does accountability matter? Well, accountability has become its own source of political conflict. But it's worth reminding ourselves of the relationship between accountability and the original intent of the law. And the original intent of the law was to close opportunity gaps. We can only do that if we hold ourselves accountable for making progress. A good accountability system sets clear expectations, focuses attention and resources on those schools that are struggling, either to serve students overall or with groups of students, and prompts action. Right? A critical part of whether or not this law will be successful will be whether or not school districts actually do something different in the schools that are struggling. We talked this morning about a school that might have English learners who are struggling. The question will be, once that is identified, then what happens? What professional development is provided? What supports are provided? What changes so that outcomes improve? I'm going to skip ahead to this slide just to show you one of the key elements of the Every Student Succeeds Act is to make sure that a school like this one isn't missed. It's a good math exercise for our high school students, a good exercise in why averages can be deceiving. This is a school where 71% of the students are proficient overall. That looks good. And in a world where disaggregated data was not required, in a world where you didn't have to focus on the performance of groups of students, this school might go unnoticed. But when you dig into the data for this school, what you see is that white students are at 86% proficient, Latino students 70%, but African American students just 30%, low-income students just 32%, students with disabilities just 33%. The notion in the Every Student Succeeds Act that we have to pay attention to the performance of groups of students is about avoiding this problem slipping through the cracks. ESSA also gives us an opportunity to focus on that educator equity problem that we've just talked about. There are resources dedicated to addressing gaps in teacher effectiveness and teacher preparation. Resources that could be directed to make sure that there are teachers well trained to work with those English learners who might be struggling in a school. Resources that could be used to make sure that there's a pipeline of secondary math science teachers to provide those advanced courses to students. Now, it's worth noting that the current administration has proposed eliminating the federal professional development dollars that were intended to address educator equity. And so budgets matter. And the effectiveness of this law will be shaped in part by whether or not the resources are there to support it. Two final thoughts before we turn to questions. I shared this quotation with folks earlier from Dr. King. It's a famous story about Dr. King talking with his kids, Dr. Martin Luther King talking with his kids about how they should view other young people, how they should think about other young people. And he said to them something that then reflects this line that he used in a speech, that you will never be what you ought to be until they are what they ought to be. He said that to his kids to say, you have a set of privileges and opportunities, but our humanity is interconnected. Our fates are interconnected. And so that privilege can't cause you to lose sight of others, right? And this ultimately, to me, is what this conversation about education equity is about. It is about making sure that we each take responsibility for those who have less opportunity, that we take responsibility for closing these achievement gaps. And this is, as I said to folks earlier today, this for me is not just an academic question or a policy question, it's a personal one. I'm standing here today, and I say this particularly to the students who are here, I'm standing here today only because I had amazing New York City public school teachers who saved my life. My life could have gone in many different directions. My mom passed away when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. In the years in between, I lived with my father who was quite sick with undiagnosed Alzheimer's. Home was this place that was scary and inconsistent, but school was nurturing and supportive and challenging and engaging and interesting. And I also was telling folks this morning, I also got in trouble in high school. First Secretary of Education had been kicked out of high school, right? Because I struggled with rules and I experienced trauma as a kid, and I was angry about that trauma. I was angry at adults. I resisted adult authority. And folks could have given up on me. That's why teacher quality matters so much. But I was blessed to have teachers who were willing to give me a second chance, who rather than say, look at all that's gone wrong and judge me by mistakes I'd made, they chose instead to look at potential and opportunity and hope. And so that's what this work is ultimately about. It's about the policy changes we need to make in order to ensure that we deliver for every child hope and opportunity. So with that, happy to take your questions.
I'm Stephanie Jansky, Director of Programming at the City Club, and today we are enjoying a forum with Dr. John B. King, Jr., President and CEO of the Education Trust and the 10th U.S. Secretary of Education. We're about to begin the audience Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, or those of us joining via our webcast or live simulcast at the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Humanities Center at Cuyahoga Community College. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will try and work it into the program. Holding our microphones today are Membership and Customer Experience Manager Corey Isler and Content Coordinator Bliss Davis. And may we have our first question?
John, thanks for being here. I'm John Zitzner with Breakthrough Schools in Cleveland. I just want to thank you because back in 2004 and 5, when we created our schools, Roxbury Prep and Uncommon Schools, where you were a leader, were an inspiration for over half of our schools, and today they're the highest performing schools in Ohio. But my question has to do with inequity of funding. You talked about it, but we didn't mention the obvious one, which is some public schools are funded pretty well, and some public schools get half to 2/3, and of course we fall in that category. But help me out. We have 798 days to January 1st, 2020, and a lot of us in the room are trying to fix the funding by then, but we don't know how.
Yeah, I mean, this challenge, and we see this across the country, states where charters are receiving less per pupil, and in some states it's primarily on the capital side, in other states it's on the capital side and the per pupil side. I think two observations about charters. from my perspective, the power of charters is that they are public schools, publicly accountable, with additional autonomy. And if that arrangement is preserved, and we are true to that arrangement, then in my view, public schools ought to be funded in a similar way. And so whether a school is managed by a district or by a charter, in either case, the school should get the resources necessary for their students. That said, and I know this is something Ohio is addressing, but we have states that fail that bargain, where the public accountability is not genuinely present. And I think about the state of Michigan. Michigan has an abysmal charter law. The result in Michigan is that you have this proliferation of low-performing for-profit charters, many involved in financial misdeeds, and very, from my perspective, very poor oversight by the authorizers. So to me, the resource allocation and genuine public accountability go hand in hand. And if you have both of those, then I think you have the promise of a charter sector that can contribute meaningfully to education more broadly. And as you know from visiting Roxbury Prep and Uncommon Schools, I think that is what is happening in a place like Massachusetts, where there's a high bar to get a charter, rigorous oversight, relatively equivalent funding, although not perfectly equal, but real meaningful accountability. That's critical.
Diamond from St. Martin de Porres High School. What alternatives do you recommend for a student that attends a high school that does not offer AP or advanced classes?
Yeah, it's a great question and a big problem. So one of the best things that students can do is to do dual credit, right? So take a class at a local college, or whether it's a community college or a four-year, and try to earn those college credits while in high school. For college applications, that's good, but we also know from research evidence that students who take dual credit classes, students who are enrolled in college credit classes and earn those credits while in high school, are more likely to graduate from high school, more likely to enroll in college, more likely to stay in college and go on to graduate. Very comprehensive long-term study of this done in Texas through Jobs for the Future. So first thing I would encourage folks to do is to think about taking those college credit courses, because you could arrange that around your high school schedule potentially. The other piece is that there are other enrichment opportunities that may not be the same as taking an AP class or an IB class, but might also be enriching. Doing research in a science lab with a professor at a university or at a research laboratory, or an internship with the mayor of the city, in the mayor's office or a city councilor's office, right? Trying to figure out what are other enrichment opportunities that you could engage in that would give you that same opportunity to go beyond just the basic high school education, but to get more.
Hi, I'm Jane Barrick. I'm a junior at Hathaway Brown, and I was just wondering what ideas you had for a replacement to the suspension system, because as we were saying, that idea that the school doesn't want them is so harmful. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So there are a number of things that we see around the country. First, what I'd say is, I was with a principal who said to me, what she tells her teachers is, not that I want fewer suspensions, I want less suspendable behavior, right? The goal is about how do we create an environment where there are less of the incidents that would cause you to have to resort to exclusionary discipline. Part of that is creating a culture that is safe, supportive, and nurturing for students. So having teachers who are well-trained around culturally responsive instruction, having teachers who know how to diffuse situations with students, having teachers whose academic instruction is rich and engaging so that students are more likely to be engaged, less likely to get in trouble. But then there are going to be those incidents where students misbehave. And there are some very promising programs around the country using restorative justice, which is about really helping students apologize for what they've done and atone for what they've done, right? So the student who writes on a desk, maybe instead of suspending that student, the student cleans all the desks, right, in the school, right? Trying to figure out what is another way to keep the student in the school community. As I said to folks earlier today, when a student fails a math quiz, we don't say to the student, no more math for you, right? But we do say that around behavior, right? You're struggling with behavior, you're struggling with the social environment, therefore we're going to exclude you. No, what we should say is we're going to help you learn how to adjust your behavior. There's something called positive behavioral intervention and support, which is a system, again, around helping students develop the sorts of habits and behaviors that will allow them to be successful. But the reality is we don't invest enough in training around this. When I was trained as a teacher, we never did anything on classroom management. I had a great master's program in teaching. We never talked about classroom management, not once. My first day of teaching 10th graders in global studies, you better believe I needed some classroom management skills, right? And so it's also about how we ensure that teachers are prepared to manage the things that are inevitably going to come up in a classroom.
Hi, how you doing? I'm Ramir Williams. I'm a senior at Richmond Heights High School. And with that being said, my question is, why would I, as a student, aspire to take an AP class and struggle all year and then pray that I get a 3 or better when I can take a college credit plus class at a local university, which is the same as the dual enrollment, and just work hard and earn a grade with a credit guaranteed, and possibly graduate from high school with an associate's degree?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's very dependent on the student's plan. So in some cases, the community college credit, let's say that you'd earn in a dual enrollment class, might not be accepted at the college that you want to go to, but an AP class will because you have that exam. So a lot depends on what college you hope to go to. So for example, I graduated from college in 3 years because of AP credits. Maybe that's why I'm a believer in APs. It saved me a lot of money. But I went to a college at Harvard where they wanted that AP exam so that they knew that it was college level work across the country, right? But if let's say you're going to a community college and you know if you get the credits there, you'll be able to transfer those to the state four-year institution. In that case, it may make more sense to do the dual credit. So it really depends. You have to really do your research about what options you want afterwards.
Good afternoon. I'm Merle Johnson, member of the State Board of Education. And I first wanted to say that the conditions that you described in Michigan around charter schools also are present in Ohio. And what happens is successful charter schools like Breakthrough get painted with that same negative brush as a number of our charters that are not doing what they should be doing and are not being held accountable. So I just had to share that, so I want you to have the correct information. But my question has to do with the students who are being suspended in preschool who are not doing well as a result of trauma. And with the brain research that is coming out, it's about 10 years old, talks about how negative conditions actually affect the brain growth of the child and makes it impossible for them to self-regulate or to make decisions. So my question is, have you heard anything about what's happening in the country around trauma-informed education, and do you know of any places where it's really making a difference?
Yeah. There's an organization in New York called Turnaround for Children that's done a lot of work on this. They've done a lot of research on exactly what you're describing, what they would just call adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, which is the idea that if a student has experienced the loss of a parent or violence in the home or domestic violence or substance addiction in the home, each of those things compounds the likelihood that they are going to have the negative consequences of trauma that's going to play out in the classroom. What Turnaround for Children focuses on is really 3 things. One is wraparound services, so access to mental health services and social workers and folks who are trained to provide intervention around trauma. And as I was mentioning to folks earlier today, we know from the Civil Rights Data Collection Survey, we've got 1.6 million students who go to a school where there's a sworn law enforcement officer but no school counselor. Right, so you think about what that means in a school where you have kids who've experienced trauma and the only person available to respond is the school resource officer, the police officer, because there's no school counselor. Right, so one of the things Turnaround for Children focus on is having those additional support staff. Second thing they focus on is training teachers to do, just as you're describing, to be trauma informed. You know, my wife taught in Harlem And she had a first grader who, when things got hard in the classroom, when something was hard academically, he would go hide under the table. And she later came to understand that the reason he did that is that his parents had been killed, and he'd been hiding when in a closet when his parents were killed. And so that was what he did. When something was difficult, he would hide. And one thing she said to me about that was that there was nothing in her teacher preparation about that, right? But there could be, right? Part of preparing teachers ought to be preparing teachers for the reality that some of their kids will have experienced trauma, and there are strategies. Some of them are about empathy building and relationship building with kids so that they feel safe and supported in the environment. So the Turnaround for Children does a lot of work with teacher training. And then there's the school culture, right? What are the routines in the school? What are the routines that the principal and assistant principal and others maintain throughout the school? And how do those routines try to address the fact that students have experienced trauma? And that can be anything from thinking about the kinds of after-school and summer supports that are in place to thinking about how you create art and music opportunities for kids and athletic opportunities for kids that help give them other venues to express themselves. But the reality is we have to love the kids we have, right? Kids come to us how they come, having this set of experiences. And as the teachers and principals, we can't change that. But we can create an environment that is nurturing and supportive. I'm blessed that I have teachers who did that for me, otherwise I wouldn't be here.
All right, we have a question from Twitter. What about the lack of minority representation in school district administration, and how is this impacting outcomes?
Yeah. Well, the same trend we see for teachers, the fact that only, majority of our kids are kids of color, but only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. We see that same trend for principals, and we see the same trend in central office administration, sometimes worse. You think about the number of superintendents who are people of color is very, very low relative to the percentage of students that are students of color. And so we see that pipeline problem all the way throughout. One of the challenges that we've written about it at the Education Trust is oftentimes teachers of color are not tapped for those leadership opportunities that then translate into becoming principals and superintendents. Right? And some of that has to do with bias and assumptions about what role people will play. So the African-American male teacher asked to do the discipline stuff, do the mentoring of the boys who are struggling, but not necessarily given the opportunity to be the instructional leader of their team, not necessarily given the opportunity to be on the path to be a principal or a superintendent. And so there's work that we need to do. To my mind, the key is there has to be intentionality about leadership, about changing the current state. I think about, there's not a lot of things that I say positive about the NFL these days, but one thing that the NFL did with great determination was implement something called the Rooney Rule, which was the idea that before you hire someone for a coach job or a general manager job, that you would at least interview seriously one candidate of color. There was no requirement to hire that candidate. There was no quota around how many candidates of color had to be hired. But they put in place this rule that you had to at least interview. And the reality is that helped change the coaching pipeline. Because now there were a set of folks who were in the room, maybe they didn't get that job, but when another owner was looking for a coach, they might ask, who do you know? And they'd mention the candidate of color they'd interviewed the last time. It helped change the pipeline. We have to have at least that level of discipline and education about trying to ensure that we make a genuine effort to have the senior leadership in school districts and states be diverse.
Thank you, Dr. King, for sharing the good news first. I'm so glad that there have been improvements made. I mean, that's very, very hopeful, especially for this group of Clevelanders and greater Clevelanders, because we work so very hard in this part of the country to help move the needle. But you did say that in order for us to change the gap, we all take responsibility for taking care of those that are less advantaged. So in a historical context and a current climate based on racism, what are some strategic ways we can mitigate the impact of racism so that the work that we do can move the needle further?
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad you asked an easy question. So a couple observations. One is to start local, right? I mentioned to folks earlier Beverly Tatum's new book. She talks about a survey that showed 75% of white folks have social networks that are entirely white. One of the things that we can do, and you can see it in this room, right? How do we create rooms that are diverse, where people are understanding the perspective of those different from them? I think about, I went to visit the school where Philando Castile worked. He was a young man, worked in the kitchen at a public Montessori school in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was killed in an interaction with police in Falcon Heights, Minnesota. And he was beloved at the school by teachers, folks who worked in the kitchen, students. So I went to visit the school where he'd worked to express my condolences, President Obama's condolences, and to mourn with the school community. And so we had a conversation about race with parents and teachers and folks at the school. And one of the things I was struck by was the degree to which people's experience of living in St. Paul was so different based on race, but people had no sense of what it was like on the other side. Right? One person, the principal, white woman, married an African-American man. And she told the group, she said, you know, I never interacted with police, ever, living in this community, till I started dating my husband. Now I interact with police a lot. And Philando Castile had been stopped some 40 some odd times by police. And one of the things that just struck me was, for many of the white folks in the room, they just had no idea that that was the experience of folks of color in the community. One white parent stopped me at the end as I was leaving and said, you know, this conversation has forced me to rethink race in our community and also what I teach my kids. Because what my kids think is, there were problems, Martin Luther King came, it's all better now. And the parent was saying, I have to correct that because that's not right. So part of what we need to do is have those kinds of cross-racial, cross-class conversations that we don't have enough as a society. That's something we can do locally. Then more broadly, I think we have to be willing to call out racism. And I was saying to folks earlier today, that doesn't mean just I'm against the KKK or I reject swastikas. Right? That is too low a bar for rejecting racism. Rejecting racism means that when there are 3.5 million people in a place that had a storm weeks ago, 85% of the people don't have power, a third of the people don't have clean water to drink, we have to call that what it is. Right? That wouldn't have happened if it was someplace else. It happened because, right? Because of who lives in Puerto Rico. It happened because of racial and ethnic bias. We have to call that out, right? And we have to be willing to call out the systems that get in the way. It is easy to call out the folks who marched in Charlottesville with torches. Now, maybe not easy for all of our elected leaders, unfortunately, but for those of us in this room, I hope it is easy to call that out as racism, but we also then have to call out, does UVA enroll significant percentages of students of color and low-income students? Right? That we have to be willing to look at the institutional forces, not just the most virulent expressions of racism. And our courage to do that, right, is what ultimately will lead to change. And I think if we're afraid to do that, if we're afraid to call that out as a community, we won't see the change. And we have to acknowledge that it's hard. You know, now we tell the story of Martin Luther King as though everybody loved him at the time. Right? That's ahistorical. That's not what happened. Right? What happened was people were angry at him. He was reviled in many places, But now, with the wisdom of the passage of time, we understand that the things he was fighting for were about justice. And we have to be willing to be courageous today about calling out where there is institutional racism at play.
Hi, I'm a 12th grader at MC Square STEM High School, and my question was, first of all, I want to say thank you for talking about this topic because I am an English learner. And my question was, what would you recommend for all the English learners who don't have the extra help?
Well, one, it's our job to make sure that English learners do have that extra help, right? It shouldn't be that a student doesn't get access to opportunity because they are learning English. So that's on us as the adults. We ought to fix that. That said, I think for students, two things. One is figuring out opportunities where you can get the help. So maybe that's a mentor, maybe that's somebody at the Boys and Girls Club, maybe that's a summer enrichment program, maybe that's another student who becomes a tutor. But you got to seek out the help that you need because it's so critical to get those skills, and you don't want to miss out on opportunities, right? The second piece is to try to, even though it's hard, try to put yourself in situations that are going to be language building. And one of the jobs of schools is to create that. One of the best schools for English learners that I visited was a school in New York, the International High School Network. Most of the students there are recent arrivals to the United States. But one of the things they do, and the students are from all over, they're probably 50 plus languages spoken in the school. But everything that happens at the school, every project, is a group project with kids who speak other languages than you do. So the only way you're going to get the project done is if you all speak English to each other, right? And what they do is that when a student first arrives, they'll have them in a pair with someone who speaks their same language but is ahead of them, but they'll be in a larger group so that they have that additional support. But then over time, what they're really forced to do by the design of the instructional experiences is practice English. So I think it's really important for students to, do the play, even though it's probably stressful and anxiety producing, right? But do the play because it's an opportunity to work on language skills. Join the debate team, even though it's stressful, because it's an opportunity to work on those language skills, right? But again, it's our job as the adults to make sure that every student has the support they need. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Today at the City Club, we have been enjoying a forum with Dr. John B. King, Jr., President and CEO of the Education Trust and the 10th United States Secretary of Education. Today's forum is part of the Education Innovation Series sponsored by Nordson. The presenting sponsor of today's forum is College Now Greater Cleveland. Additionally, we welcome guests at tables hosted by the Cleveland Museum of Art, Friends of Breakthrough Schools, and the Northeastern Ohio Education Association. We also welcome students from Garrett Morgan High School, Hathaway Brown, MC Squared STEM High School, Richmond Heights Schools, and St. Martin de Porres. Student participation in City Club forums is provided by many foundations, including the William E. Weiss Foundation. We thank all of you for being here today. Could we please give our students a round of applause? And that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you, Dr. King, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Payne Fund, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.